Okay, let me see if this webcam is working this time. I'm hoping that I can see what's going on. It helps me to know that you guys are getting that's working. Okay. Also lets me know how scary I look today. So, sometimes you guys will see me with or without makeup. Usually, if you see me without makeup, it's good to know that I am probably a good. You probably should know that I am at that point, probably on the weekend, and so I don't wear makeup on the weekend. So I'm recording for you on the weekend if you see me without makeup. Okay, so we're gonna want to tell you a couple of things real quick, and then we'll get started with the history of healthcare. If you have questions or problems, please be sure that you're emailing me and let me know what's going on. I'm going to do my best to keep the ticker going on, or the clock going over here in the corner, so that I know and I don't go over y'all's time. Um, so, the other thing I want you guys to know is that if you have questions or problems, please let me know. Message me on through Google Classroom or email me. You can go and you can email me or message me anytime. Sometimes I can't get to you right away because I'm with another class, but I will get to you at my conference. I will get to you before or after school. So please, if you're having problems or questions or anything is going on, please let me know so that we can if you don't understand something, you need more information, please let me know. Okay, so we're going to get started with the history of healthcare. So we're going to talk about ancient times, and there's lots of things that from the ancient times, from Neanderthals forward, that we still use today in healthcare. I know it's kind of remarkable with all of the advances we have in healthcare that we still use some things from ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, and especially Chinese medicine. We use lots of Chinese medicine still today. So first, we're going to talk about ancient times as far back as the Neanderthals. I mean, realistically, they didn't live to be about 15 or 20 years. Didn't live at about 15 or 20 years, and their whole life was about survival. Injury prevention, trying not to get eaten by a predator, and trying to find food and shelter and food, water, and shelter. So that was kind of their whole being was about survival. It was thought that illness was due to supernatural spirits. They didn't know anything, so they didn't know so much about healthcare, but they did know that there were certain plants or herbs or things that they could utilize that would help fix certain issues with their body. So they used different types of herbs, and plants were used as medicine, and some of them we still use today. We're going to talk about several of those that are still used today. Foxglove was used to help slow the heart rate, to help make the heart beat better, and we still use it in the form of digitalis. Now, foxglove is made into a medication that can be digitalis, which can be given as a pill. It can be given IV or as an injection. Excuse me, you guys. I'm so sorry. And it makes the heartbeat stronger and slows a rapid heart rate. So it's an important drug that we still use today. Also, quinine is still used to treat malaria. It comes from the cinchona tree, and it also was used in ancient times to control fever, to help with muscle spasms. We still use derivatives from it for other things too. We use quinolones, which is a derivative of it's a derivative of the cinchona tree. We use parts of it to make quinolones as well. So quinine, some of your great grandparents or great great grandparents probably were given that as a child for different illnesses. Belladonna and atropine are from the nightshade plant. I'm going to kind of give you guys a funny little anecdote about nightshade. So, not this last summer, but the summer before last, my husband and I were fortunate enough to go to Ireland for a few days in the summer, and we went to the Blarney Castle. Most people that know about the Blarney Castle, what you hear them talk about is the Blarney Stone, and if you kiss the Blarney Stone, it will bring you good luck. Well, I'm claustrophobic. I don't like enclosed spaces, and in castles, things are very tight. Passageways and stairwells and things are very, very small. And so I didn't actually go into the Blarney Castle. My husband did. And I sat down out by a garden, a beautiful garden entry. And it was called the Poison Gardens. And inside this poison garden, it was cultivated and grown many years ago by one of the women of the house that had lived there through several, 6, I think, husbands, maybe 7. And she had survived 7 husbands, and she treated their illnesses from this poison garden. And in there, some of the things that were there were foxglove, nightshade, wolf's bane, poppy plants were in there. Different things were in there that she used to treat her spouses, but probably used some of them to poison them as well. So belladonna can be used in small amounts. It relaxes the body. So sometimes it's used as a suppository. A belladonna, an opioid suppository, is used sometimes to help relax bladder spasms. Belladonna can also be used to help people rest. You have to be very careful with the administration of that because too much will actually kill someone. Atropine is used for multiple things. It's used as an eye drop. It's used in a crash cart for cardiac issues. So atropine is used for a lot of different things. We still use the poppy plant or opium plant today for pain medication. It's made into morphine. It's made into codeine, and we use that still today. You give morphine for severe pain like heart attack or post-operative just after a significant painful surgery. Codeine is given for minor to moderate pain like broken bones, or when you have teeth extracted, things like that. They may give you Tylenol with codeine. Hydrocodone is actually synthetically produced. It doesn't actually come from the opium plant, but it's genetically made or synthetically made. So the ancient Egyptians, we're going to talk about them for a few minutes because they did that's kind of where a lot of our really important historical medical records related to healthcare and prescriptions and things we started to see those when we uncovered the pyramids and actually went down in them and saw some of the things that were in there. We saw things that we still use today. Once again, ancient Egyptians, they have the earliest health records. They're healers, and there could be multiple types of healers. Generally, they were a priest to a certain god. But they kept meticulous records. So it was believed that if one particular healer treated one thing, that a lot of superstitions where, you followed what they said because they were a direct connection to the gods, and the gods were telling them how to heal people or take care of things. They would be that conduit to the god to ask how they could get better. So those healers were very specific, and they were kind of mysterious as well. Ancient Egyptians identified certain diseases. Smallpox is one of those. Malaria is also one that once we read through some of those, we could see that it was a very good description of what malaria is today. Pharaohs had many specialists. Pharaohs were the rulers of ancient Egypt, and they would keep many specialists, many healers. Some of them were considered priests. Some of them were magicians. Different kinds of healers that they kept to keep them healthy and well, and to keep the gods happy. So, like I said, priests were the doctors, and all healthcare, because the priests generally stayed in their temples unless they were directly in the house of the pharaoh. Then everyone would go to their temples not only to worship but for medical care, and then healers were educated by other healers in the temples. So it was kind of like going to 7-Eleven. Everything was there, or Walmart. Everything was there that people needed as far as their health care. So there was only one priest that could read the medical knowledge of the god Thoth. The one priest that was able to do that was the one who helped start the education for other healers. The god Thoth was said to be the god who healed Horus when he fought Seth for the rule of ancient Egypt. And Seth was said to have plucked out Horus's eye, and his mother prayed to Thoth to heal him, and he got his eye. He got his vision back. Long story, but basically, the whoever was the direct link to Thoth was the one who provided medical care. Like I said, magicians were also considered healers because they could do mysterious things. Magicians were more the ones who believed that demons cause disease. You'll see throughout a lot of ancient history up until the time of the ancient Greeks, they started to believe that that the body caused health issues, not so much demons or offending the gods caused disease. But the ancient Egyptians definitely, certain parts of them believed that demons cause diseases. And what you're seeing there, what you can see there on the side, the image there in the slide, that's actually a ancient prescription. So that was one of the first prescriptions that was found in a temple. And basically what that prescription is, it's hieroglyphs or hieroglyphics that tell how to mix certain things for healing. Embalming. The ancient Egyptians were the first people to embalm bodies. You know those more specifically as mummies, where organs were removed, and they were put in special containers. And then the body was wrapped in this type of gauze or muslin or cheesecloth kind of stuff that it was dipped in very strong antiseptics and solutions, and the body was wrapped in it. That's what prevented the decaying. Only the special priests were allowed to do the embalming or to do the mummification, because they had to have a very advanced knowledge of anatomy. They had to know how to get the brain out of the nose. They had to know how to get the heart out of the body, the intestines, the liver, the kidneys. They had to know how to get those out of the body the correct way. So only very special priests did that procedure, the embalming procedure, and they were not the priests who provided medical care. They were different priests that were trained very differently. Also, when we researched mummies after we started to remove them from the tomb and take them back to museums, we found that the ancient Egyptians had arteriosclerosis or heart disease, coronary artery disease. They had kidney stones. They had arthritis. They had many of the same health issues we still have today. Some of the medical practice that ancient Egyptians used that we still use today are enemas. Enemas is a large bag of fluid that's that has a tube running out of the bag of fluid. Sometimes it's a soap sud with water and some dish liquid, literally. Sometimes it has a high potassium content. Sometimes it has an oil in it. But enemas the tube is inserted into the rectum, and that fluid is allowed to drain into the bowel to help unclog a lower GI obstruction. So sometimes enemas are still given to clean out the colon. Circumcision is still done. Now circumcision is done shortly after birth. During ancient Egyptian times, it was done after marriage. So it was part of the marriage ceremony. They closed wounds by sewing them up, not in the same way we do today, but very similar. And they also set fractures. You wouldn't think that ancient Egyptians would know how to set fractures, but they did. They didn't. They did it by touch, and we do it by X-ray. So you had to have very special skills to be a healthcare provider back in ancient Egypt. So how would they have performed these skills? Once again, repeating it. With very specific practices. And, when we think about what could we use today to do those things, we close wounds all different kinds of ways. We have, synthetic sutures. We still have catgut sutures that we use. We use glues to close wounds. So there's lots of things that we still do and that the ancient Egyptians kind of started. And this is that story of the Eye of Horus. About 5,000 years ago, the magic eye is what it's called, and that's that image to the right. It was a charm worn to guard against disease, suffering, and evil. The Eye of Horus, ancient Egyptians wore it around their neck. And some of them were very, very expensive eyes of Horus because they were made of solid gold. And like I said, historically, Horus lost his vision or lost his eye in an attack by Seth, who was the brother of Horus's father, who was the Pharaoh of Egypt. His mother Isis called on Thoth, who was the god of healing, to restore his sight, and his sight was restored. He really could have just poked him in the eye and it messed his vision up for a little while. We don't know. But the way that the Eye of Horus was worn, it over time developed into what we use today as the sign of pharmacy, the R and the X. And if you look at the Eye of Horus, and if you think back about how ancient Egyptians used eyeliner and eye makeup, it kind of makes sense to see that you can kind of see that RX there. Especially in some of the older signs in the 30s and 40s and 50s, you can really see that sweeping tail and some of those kind of things on the old RXs. We move on from the ancient Egyptians to Jewish medicine, and if you think about, they're closely related because the Jews were slaves of the Egyptians, and they were the people who built a lot of the temples. Jewish people didn't believe in superstitions, and they only believed in one God, not many gods. So they didn't believe in superstition. Now, they did believe that you could offend their God, and that might affect your health. But they also believed in concentrating on certain types of food. They didn't eat food that came from the backside of an animal because it could be covered in feces. They didn't eat organ meat. So there were specific ways they handled food that they ate as well. They believed in keeping themselves where they prepared food, and the way food was, and the way animals were prepared for consumption. They believed that and keeping all of that really clean. Also, if someone was ill, they would quarantine that family off to help pass on illness. Moses, who was very important to the Jewish faith, he was someone who led the Jewish slaves away from Egypt. He was a pre-Hippocratic medical practice. So Hippocratic medical practice is what we do now. It actually reverts back to the Greeks, to Hippocrates, but we'll talk about that a little later. But he believed God was the only physician, and so all of that, the magicians and the healers and stuff, he basically banned that from the Jewish faith. He also enforced that day of rest. So if we think about that, we know that rest is very important to healing as well, and to health. We have to sleep, we have to rest, we have to let our bodies repair. And prior to the ancient Egyptian, or the Jewish slaves leaving Egypt, they were not able to rest. They were basically made to work around the clock at times, depending on what was going on. Now we get to the ancient Greeks. So Greeks were the first people to study diseases and why people got sick. Hippocrates was one of the great philosophers, but also because he philosophized on, or he did philosophical studies on how the body worked. He's also considered the father of medicine. The way they researched, and the way philosophy, and the way that they tried to study medicine and to study diseases, they eliminated a lot of the superstitions that were out there about illness and about the body. They determined that unsanitary practices were associated with the spread of disease, not washing your hands, not keeping your body clean, not cleaning an area where things are butchered, reusing water like bath water to drink, things like that. They figured out that would spread disease. So we talk about Hippocrates. He was the person we consider the father of medicine. He did not believe in dissection, only what you could observe by touching the body and what you could see on the body. That's what we refer to now as gross anatomy. He took very careful notes on the way someone's body, or what happened, what were the signs and symptoms, and what happened from the beginning to the end of an illness or a disease. And he realized that disease was not supernatural; it was actually a body's process. So that's how we come upon that Hippocratic medicine, and and that's how that we talk about the Hippocratic oath when we talk about medicine today. Doctors take a Hippocratic oath, and it's basically an understanding. It started with that understanding that disease and illness is related to the body, not not spiritual forces. He wrote standards and ethics, which are the basis of today's medicine. So ethical conduct with people, with patients. That's why we consider him the father of medicine. Also, and I always pronounce this guy's name. Sorry, guys. Hang on one second. My phone is buzzing, and being here on the weekend, sometimes I have to go ahead and pick that up. So hold on a second. Okay, guys. Sorry about that. Esculapius, and that still may be wrong. Esculapius, I think, is how you pronounce the Greek god of medicine. Sorry about that. The Greek god of medicine. That's where we got the staff and the serpent. That we would, like what you're seeing to the left is a symbol of healing. There's all Esculapius could also be thought of as the angel of healing. So the symbol was a staff with a serpent winding around it with wings. Temples were built in Esculapius's honor because, and they became the first real clinics and hospitals that were utilized. We still that symbol is still synonymous with medicine today. Roman medicine, they learned from the Greeks how to develop sanitation systems and aqueducts and sewer systems where water could be transported in and out, waste could be transported in and out, water could be cleaned at some point. Also, they had public baths where you would keep the body clean. So that was kind of the beginning of public health. The aqueducts, the sewers, the sanitation system, making sure that trash didn't build up, and there was a more strong emphasis on cleanliness in the body and also in the area. Ancient Romans had a very strong love of all things that were beautiful, and if trash piled up, that wasn't so pretty. So they had sanitation systems. They had aqueducts and sewers and public baths to help with health. And like I said, that was the beginning of what we would think of as the beginning of public health. Public health is very different now, but it was a beginning. They had the first organized medical care. So they actually had army medicine, or military medicine. They had rooms in doctors' houses that became the first hospital. They also made public hygiene mandatory. So they made solid construction of homes where there wasn't as much dirt for people to breathe in. They built land up so that there was control of floods where bugs and snakes and different kinds of pests would not, and rats and things wouldn't collect in that area. So it was really it was a way to improve cleanliness. Now, when we get to the Dark Ages, not a lot happens in the Dark Ages. We kind of backslid away from 400 to 800 AD. We kind of just went back to that, believing that all care was spiritual and that medical practices were done in convents and monasteries and in the home, and life and death was totally at the hands of God. There was less emphasis on trying to figure out what was going on in the body and more prayer and those spiritual practices during the Dark Ages. The Middle Ages we kind of start to figure out, because due to epidemics during the Middle Ages in 800 to 1400 AD, there was the plague, and there was the plague, which took, or the Black Death, which took out literally half the world. Smallpox, diphtheria, syphilis, measles, typhoid, tuberculosis. These were all terrible epidemics that took out hundreds and thousands and millions of people. I mean, they took out half of the world, literally. So they had to figure out what was going on so that civilization could continue on. In the late part of the Middle Ages, they really kind of started to look at what's going on and why is everybody dying and why is this spreading so rapidly. Disease spread due to the way people lived. Cities were in a confined area. Sanitation, because people lived in a densely populated areas, sanitation was an issue. Cleanliness was an issue. People were traveling on the ocean at that time, and traveling around the world. The Crusaders, they spread disease. When people would come on ships, they would get on and off the boat due to nutrition and due to diseases on boats in those confined areas. Then they would get off of boats and they would spread that into the cities and the harbors where they lived. When we start to realize that disease is not spiritual, it's actually contagious, they started to make quarantine laws. And some of the saddest things I can remember reading as a history student and as a nursing student was how during the plague, they would literally, if one person in the house got the plague, they would literally board up the whole house with everyone in it. And you could hear people crying and screaming and trying to get out of the homes, but they wouldn't let them out when they started to pass quarantine laws. They weren't ethical, they weren't humane, but that is what they did to stop the spread of diseases. Now, during the Renaissance time, things start to get better. We start to do more research. We start to go back to that thought that, when we realize that diseases are spreading, then we're the problem, not necessarily the gods. Our body is the problem, and we need to figure out why and how to stop that from happening. The Renaissance period itself, throughout, whether it's medicine or literature or science or math, the Renaissance period is a true time of innovation. We start to kind of branch out and try to figure out the world and different things. Medical schools and universities start to develop, and then we start to do research. During the Renaissance period, we actually kind of went against the ancient Greeks, and we started to do dissection, not necessarily on humans, but on animals that help us do comparative anatomy. The first printing presses were developed, so books, they were manual, but they could actually take the manuscript, the very detailed notes that were being kept, and start to make books. In the 16th and 17th century, Leonardo da Vinci, if you've seen the very first image that we saw in the beginning of this, where that's Leonardo da Vinci's his rendition of the human body in motion, and that's kind of a really cool thing because he really was interested in the human anatomy. Leonardo da Vinci was a very remarkable man, not just related to human anatomy, but lots of other things. He was a great inventor. Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and I always pronounce that wrong also, he developed the first microscope in 1676. So think about how remarkable that is, that we went from having to look at things with the naked eye, listen to things with the ear to determine what was going on in the body. Now we could actually look at things under a microscope. We could see microorganisms. We could see cells, sort of. We could see shapes and things much more magnified than we could with the naked eye. William Harvey, he determined that there was actually, not only did blood circulate in the body, but also that there were more than one type of cell related to the blood. Gabriel Fallopian, so that one's pretty easy. He discovered the fallopian tubes and started to study the reproductive system. Bartholomew Eustachius, he discovered that there was a eustachian tube in the ear. So through that dissection, we started to see more advanced knowledge of anatomy and more advanced knowledge of how things worked in the body. Don't get me wrong, barbers were still pulling teeth and they were still doing minor surgery and wound care. And yes, the barber, the red and white pole on the barber, on the outside of the barber shop that you see now, if you go to a real barber, that swirling red and white pole, what that really was and where that really came from is barbers would reuse dressings. And some of the blood soaked them so significantly that it would not come out of the dressing. So it was really developed from the blood stained, and the fresh, clean bandages flapping in the wind and making a circular motion. That's what that really came from. So barbers would pull teeth. You go in and get a shave and a haircut and a molar pulled and some wound care done if you needed it, all in one place. In the 18th century, Edward Jenner, or in 1796, he developed the first smallpox vaccine. That was huge because smallpox, along with the plague, were some of the things that were causing mass epidemics. Joseph Priestley discovered oxygen, the element oxygen, and figured out that oxygen was rampant in the air and in our bodies. Benjamin Franklin invented the bifocals, which was very important because it could improve vision where we could actually see better. He figured out that colds were communicable, that it was one of those things that could be passed from one person to another. Linneck invented the stethoscope. Great invention for those of us in healthcare because we stopped listening to the chest and the belly with our ear, and now we could have magnified sound to help us with assessment and diagnosing. In the 19th and 20th century, so in the 1900s, Inez Semmelweis identified that possibly, and when you watch the introduction to healthcare video that you watched, you had a little bit about Semmelweis where he talked about how important it was to wash your hands and how doctors were basically transmitting illness. And so he also, he was kind of initially thought of as a quack, but later on it was determined that he really knew what he was talking about and helped cut down childbirth fever, cut it in half, cut that way down, and people were living longer after they delivered babies. Louis Pasteur, super important to not just medicine and microorganisms and microbiology, but to the way we get food today. Most of you have heard of pasteurization in one form or another. Eggs and dairy have to go through pasteurization. Medications that we receive that are injected, they go through pasteurization. So he developed the germ theory, and that germs were communicable, and microorganisms were what were causing these illnesses. So Louis Pasteur was very important. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop there. That's about 33 minutes of lecture. I think that's enough for today. So you guys, I hope you took good notes. You've watched your video because we're going to have a quiz tomorrow. Okay, so have a great day. I'll see you guys soon. Thanks, everybody.